The common definition of a swordsman you'll find in the dictionary is someone who fights and is skilled with a sword. In One Piece, many of the strongest fighters wield a sword, such as Roger, Rayleigh, Zoro, Fujitora, and so on. However, for some reason, there's always a debate on whether or not some sword wielders can be classified as swordsmen, and it's all because of one man named Dracula Mihawk. Mihawk, as you all know, is the strongest swordsman alive in One Piece, and so naturally, he stands above all swordsmen in the world. But as you know, some people just can't let it be that simple, and it all starts with a particular redhead named Shanks. As you all know, Shanks was a former rival to Mihawk, and they used to have legendary daily duels which Whitebeard took note of. However, their rivalry ended once Shanks lost an arm 12 years ago, and since then, Mihawk hasn't been interested in fighting Shanks. The thing is though, despite losing an arm, Shanks is still strong. And I mean really strong. So strong in fact that he's even convinced some fans that he's as strong or potentially stronger than the Pirate King Roger. But you see, this creates a problem because while Shanks is running around looking like an aura demon, clashing with Whitebeard, stopping a Kainu, Haki blasting Green Bull and one-shotting Kid, he's doing all this while wielding a sword. And since Mihawk is the strongest swordsman, that means Shanks is weaker than Mihawk. The problem is, this doesn't sit right with some people, because if we just go off on-screen feats, Shanks clearly has Mihawk beat, right? I mean, all Mihawk has done was clash with Vista, cut an island-sized iceberg, which is good, and defeat East Blue Zoro. So what Shanks has done on screen pales in comparison to what Mihawk's done, right? In order to remedy this problem, fans created terms like true swordsman, sword user, and a bunch of other jazz. The idea was to separate swordsmen that would fit under Mihawk's title and other swordsmen that wouldn't fit under that title. Some have even gone as far to argue that all Meito wielders are swordsmen due to translations like Viz calling it famous swords, despite the description listing spears and other weapons as well. For example, Whitebeard wields a Naginata that is also a Meito, but he's not a swordsman. People that argue this nonsense usually try to sully the validity of Mihawk's title by comparing him to Whitebeard. Unless people are just silly and think Mihawk's title is a lie when he's actually stated to be the strongest in both name and reality, any living sword user that is argued to be stronger than Mihawk is likely going to be argued to not be a swordsman entirely, and this is the camp Shanks typically falls under for those that think he's stronger than Mihawk. For a long time, this distinction between a swordsman and a non-swordsman sword user hasn't been made explicitly clear in the story, with a clear example of both types. Many people, including myself, felt like it made the most sense to categorize someone as a swordsman if they are at their strongest when using the sword. However, chapter 1023 made things a little less straightforward with a particular Lunarian. Now, as you can tell by the title and thumbnail, the point of this video isn't to cover Mihawk vs Shanks, but to understand the meaning of a swordsman in One Piece. But before we delve into it though, be sure to smash the like button and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy content like this, and as always, your support is much appreciated. If I had to consolidate this topic into one sentence, it'd be Oda just picks and chooses which sword user is or isn't a swordsman. I know that may come across as a cop-out answer, but it really is that simple, and you'll start to realize there isn't a fighting style criteria for swordsmanship. You can be a Delver user like Law and Fujitora and still be a swordsman. You can fight like a circus clown and still be a swordsman, and you can even perform a sword technique without a sword and still be a swordsman. There are various types of swordsmen in One Piece that use various types of abilities even outside of strictly the sword, but as I alluded to earlier, the distinction between a swordsman and a non-swordsman sword user was highlighted with Zoro and King. In chapter 1023, King starts the fight off by activating a mechanism on his sword that traps and takes Zoro's swords away from him. King follows this up by a punch with his spiked fist, to which Zoro surmises that King is a killer machine type of fighter. King responds to this by asking if a school or style is necessary to fight, to which Zoro agrees isn't necessary and acknowledges that King never called himself a swordsman in the first place. Essentially, the main takeaway from this is that despite King being a sword user, he's a killer machine type of fighter and not a swordsman. Bones is another example that distinguished himself from swordsmen despite being a human blade and fits into this killer machine type of fighter as well. Not only that, but this dialogue also defines swordsmen as those who adhere to a school or style of swordsmanship, and that style's forms and techniques. To understand this better, we'll use Zoro as an example. Zoro is a 3-sword style practitioner, meaning the 3-sword style is his school or style of swordsmanship. 3000 Worlds is one of the forms or techniques of the 3-sword style. Now let's use Fujitora as another example. Fujitora is a practitioner of the Gravity Blade, which is his style of swordsmanship. Raging Tiger is one of the forms or techniques of Fujitora's Gravity Blade style. This is a more accurate way of understanding what King was asking and why Zoro acknowledges that King never considered himself a swordsman, because King doesn't adhere to a style of swordsmanship and its techniques. Having said all that, not every swordsman in the series announces their sword style when they're performing a technique like Zoro does. In fact, even Zoro sometimes just names his technique without announcing his sword style. I can only think of a few swordsmen in the series that announced their sword style in the first place, such as Oden and his Oden 2-sword style, Kinemon and his Foxfire style, and there's probably some other obvious names that I'm forgetting. On the other hand, Law and Kaku are examples of swordsmen that don't announce their sword style before they perform techniques. Even though Law's sword style isn't named like Kaku's 4-sword style is, it's stated in magazine 14 that Law's swordsmanship is a combination of his cursed blade and his delve fruit abilities. Oda even described Law as a swordsman alongside Zoro, Brook and Kinemon, and he even lectures Tashigi on the way of a swordsman. Law's Kikoku is stated in the SBS to be a cursed sword, and it takes a strong swordsman to master cursed swords and bend them to their will. He was also taught sword skills by Diamante when he was a child and has continued to use a sword ever since. With that said, since we understand that Law is in fact a swordsman, that inherently means he fights with a style of swordsmanship despite it not being named. So just to consolidate this point, swordsmen in One Piece are those who adhere to a school or style of swordsmanship, and that style's forms and techniques regardless of whether or not the style of swordsmanship is named or not. This is why I said that defining swordsman as anyone who's at their strongest with a sword could work for most, but isn't that easy and straightforward, as it doesn't account for someone like King who uses a sword for his strongest techniques. On the opposite side, there's a type of sword wielding fighters that wouldn't be considered swordsmen, and the only example of this as of this recording is King the Wildfire. Please don't let anyone gaslight you into thinking there's confirmation of others like King, because there aren't. This is why I said at the beginning that swordsmen in One Piece are just whoever Oda decides are swordsmen, because at face value, it doesn't seem like King fights too differently from other versatile swordsmen like Kaku or Kabaji. Kabaji's fighter style uses circus tricks such as a fire blast, smoke screen and spinning tops, but he's still a swordsman. However, King uses fire abilities, air slashes from his wings, and he even likes a good sword duel but isn't considered to be a swordsman. Since King has openly rejected the notion of needing a style and techniques of swordsplay, then we can confidently put him in the non-swordsman category. The point is, we can't just go off how one's fighter style appears to be at face value and categorize them based on it. The only objective measure to determine if one isn't a swordsman is if they outright deny it like Bones did, or they don't adhere to a style and its techniques of swordsmanship. If that still isn't convincing enough and you still think King should be considered a swordsman, then hopefully this will help smooth things out. Many people like to bring up the fact that King likes a good sword duel as the main reason as to why he's a swordsman. However, if this is the moment King made it a sword duel, that means everything prior to this wouldn't be considered a sword duel. Prior to this, Zoro demanded respect and preferred to be killed by the sword, so King's Imperial Archer wasn't considered to be swordsmanship by Zoro. Some will argue that King also wanted to die by the sword, but that's actually not what he's asking, but rather is demanding expecting Zoro to also show him respect, as Zoro just cut his mask, and as we know, King is trying to hide the fact he's a Lunarian from the world. It's important to note that when King decided to give Zoro a sword duel, it was at a point of the fight where he was winning, and it was only for a brief time at the end of chapter 1032. However, after Zoro became the King of Hell and started dominating the fight, King defaulted back to his fighting style that Zoro considered to be a killing machine. The difference between using a sword and using a sword style is something Zoro highlighted all the way back in Syrup Village, and that's what separates non-swordsman sword users and actual swordsmen. In this specific context, the Nyaban brothers thought Zoro's skill or strength would be the same regardless of using 2 extra swords, to which Zoro had to demonstrate the difference between having 3 swords and being a practitioner of 3 sword style. Now, I'm sure some of you are probably rubbing your hands together like Birdman thinking about ways to call certain sword users non-swordsmen. Like I said, King is the only sword user that's borderline stated to not be a swordsman, so I figured let's cover some other polarizing sword users. The first being Big Mom, who is a wielder of Napoleon. Many may consider her to be a sword-swinging brute. However, Ikoku sovereignty is actually a sword technique of the giants and is stated that she mastered the swordsmanship of the giants. Some may dispute this as Big Mom is a destructive fighter and seems to contradict Mihawk and Koshiro's views on the sword, that there is no strength in a sword without softness, or that a sword that harms everything it touches could not be called a sword. If this philosophy is the end-all be-all to being a swordsman, this would suggest that East Blue Zoro isn't a swordsman until he fought Mr. One, as it was in that fight that his violent swordsmanship evolved due to the breath of all things. It's also just conjecture to say Big Mom couldn't choose what she doesn't want to cut, as the moments in which we do see her fight, there's no reason for her to show any restraint. So since Big Mom adheres to the style of the giants and has mastered its techniques, she would be considered a swordsman. The next two are probably the most polarizing, and their fighting styles seem to be the same. Roger and Shanks both wield swords that are stated to be their beloved swords, which is a common description said about swordsmen and their blade, such as with Mihawk, Odin and Shiryu. In fact, in the case of Roger, it's stated his sword Ace is one of the 12 supreme grade blades, which requires a strong swordsman to master, and not only that, but he seemingly named his son after his sword as well. As you all know, Shanks was once Mihawk's rival, and it's stated they competed ruthlessly over their swordsmanship skills. Although some may argue that Shanks' fighting style changed after losing an arm, his current day strength is still used to highlight the caliber of the world's strongest swordsman's skills. It wouldn't make any sense for Oda to use a non-swordsman to hype up how great Mihawk's swordsmanship is. Even though Divine Departure wasn't explicitly stated to be a sword technique in the same way Ikoku was, based on the little we know of Roger and Shanks, there's no reason why they shouldn't be categorized as swordsmen. The last thing to cover is Haki and swordsmanship, and it should go without saying that high-level swordsmanship is rooted in Haki. Clear examples of this is the Breath of All Things, which is rooted in Armament Haki and could be rooted in Observation Haki as well, considering how Zoro was able to sense his sword that was under a rock. Forging a permanent black blade is also rooted in Haki, even though we don't know the specifics into how they are forged. It's also stated in Zoro's Vivid Card entry that his swordsmanship drastically improved over the time skip, and the main thing he learned was how to use Haki. Zoro even created a new variant to his 3-sword style entirely after mastering Advanced Conqueror's Haki. Haki in of itself isn't a fighting style, but rather is a power that enhances any fighting style. So just because a sword user excels in Haki does not automatically omit them from being a swordsman. So just to wrap things up, a swordsman in One Piece is a fighter that adheres to a style or school of swordsmanship, and that style's forms and techniques, regardless of whether or not the style is named or not. If a sword user doesn't adhere to the aforementioned criteria, then they wouldn't be considered a swordsman. High-level swordsmanship is rooted in Haki, and just because a sword user excels at Haki does not automatically omit them from being a swordsman. So hopefully that solves the swordsman problem in One Piece and gives you a better understanding on the meaning of a swordsman in One Piece. At the end of the day, these are just my thoughts, so let me know what you think in the comments below. Smash the like button and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed. I've been the one and only Zage, and until next time.